All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. As you can tell, I'm wearing red.
Oh, that's right.
That's right. Yeah. So, on behalf of the Workforce Development Council, we would like to welcome you to this Economic Outlook webinar. And my name is Banat Misalucha. I'm the Executive Director of the Workforce Development Council. I'd like to, first of all, acknowledge our WDC Chair, Ken Louie. Ken, are you there? Wave your hand. And then we also have our Workforce Development Division Administrator, Maricar uh, Freitas, and also our Administrative Services Office Administrator, Lynn Araki Regan. So WDC, in case you did not know, is an attached agency to the Department of Labor and Industrial Relations. We are the policy and planning advisor to the state and the governor on workforce development issues. We are mandated both federally and through HRS 202 to develop, modify, and implement the state unified plan for workforce development. And it is really towards this regard that we're sponsoring this economic forum because as we implement our unified plan, it's important for us to make sure that there's alignment with our economic growth. So we are very fortunate to have with us today a very esteemed, very sought after speaker. But before I introduce him, I just want to gently remind everyone to please mute your sets or whatever it is you want to call it. Turn off your videos if possible. And so here's our agenda. We're going to hear from our speaker. He's going to be talking about both the national and the local economic perspective and landscape. And then after which he's going to respond to questions if you have any. So he's like I mentioned, he's a much sought after speaker. I've known him, as I was recalling, we both were bankers at some point of our lives. I was at Central Pacific Bank, but he was the chief economist at Bank of Hawaii. But he's done so many amazing things in his journey, his career, and one of which he was the former chair of the Hawaii Council on Revenues. So, and I know he can incorporate other things that he did, interesting things that he did, because I didn't get a copy of the bio, unfortunately. But I think he does not need any introductions because I'm sure you have heard of him or have heard him speak at some forum. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Paul Brewbaker, who is joining us actually from Oregon. Go ahead, Paul. Oh, there's your bio. Thank you.
You're muted.
I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Jeanette, for the introduction from your own personal experience. And of course, coming back to Hawaii and being able to join banking and Bank of Hawaii at the time in the capacity that I had, which, this is before the internet, before personal computers, or right when they were dropping, but, nobody had them. And the banks, least of all, were um, distributing them to employees was an unusual but extraordinary time to be a part of a transition in the workforce where and I really feel like the AI moment um, resonates a lot with the rhymes with the interval from 1985 when I joined the bank as a full-time employee to 1995, that 10 years during which, I started out from scratch, bought my first personal computer, went to HonFed and got a personal loan to buy a personal computer because um, they were so expensive. And, um, and at the end of the arc of that 10 years, became the chief economist at the bank and was responsible for downsizing it because 1995 was also the year that BOH.com went live. We literally coded a team of about 6 or 8 people from all over, coded BOH.com in hypertext markup language. Can you believe it? And the idea was we would post all our research on this website and save $250,000. This is in dog years. This is $250,000 in 1995 dollars. Save on printing and publication expense, which was how we produced and distributed our reports at that time. And so, as a consequence of which, we realized very quickly the bank doesn't even need a research department if everything's going to be on the internet. And so, over the subsequent 5 years, I had to downsize. Like a bunch of people in federal government management positions having to fire people. I had to downsize the department because of a profound structural change in the way banking and other aspects of economic activity occurred as a consequence of the bridge of technological innovation from desktop personal computing to internet as an information portal. And here we are, zooming. So with that backdrop, and again, I can't emphasize this more, with some resonance to a moment 30 years ago when another technological revolution really profoundly altered the economic landscape. Let me get into some of what Bennett and I have been talking about presenting today. So, okay, I was going to be the Hawaii guy. And Bennett asked me to do a national, bring in some national perspective. I do national economic forecasting, but for nobody other than myself. So I just got my email from Bloomberg. They need my new forecast. So I still, in my profession, I participate just so I can be part of the circle. But I don't spread it around Hawaii because we have DBED and we have UHERO, and that's enough people. It used to be 4 because we had First Hawaiian Bank and we had Bank of Hawaii, but those days are over. So I hate to do this because I'm not a table guy, I'm a graph guy, but I'm just going to walk you through a couple tables that I think are pertinent and should help frame what the expectation was coming into Trump 2.0. And the short answer to what the implication of that is, the shorter answer is chaos and uncertainty bring with it bad, unpredictable outcomes. So that's the theme. Thankfully, nowadays, this was not true when I was in banking, but nowadays, the Fed publishes their forecast. And if you're somebody like me who still pays attention to financial economics and monetary policy, this is hugely informative because if you know what the policymaker is expecting, then it kind of doesn't matter what you or the market or whatever think, because they're the policymaker. So they're the ones who are going to set the target overnight interbank lending rate, the Fed funds rate, and everything else is just the term structure of interest rates, the term premium, which is determined by macroeconomic forces, inflation expectations, perceptions of risk and risk premium in the term structure, which is the difference between long-term interest rates and short-term interest rates. So I'm going to focus here on, now that you've looked at this for a few moments, focus on 4 rows and then on 2 kinds of columns. These are the median forecasts of the 19 members of the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, which comprised the 12 Federal Reserve governors and in principle their staffs of PhD economists, and then the 7, when they're all when they've all been appointed, the 7 governors of the Federal Reserve and their staffs at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, D.C. The columns, two sets of columns. One, the first 4 columns of data are the next, 4 years. This is the December forecast, so 2024 was as yet unknown. We now have better clarity, but this was very close. And then long-term equilibrium, why is that important? Because if you're looking down the road, if you're planning, you need an idea of where the long-term equilibrium should be. So these longer-term numbers are important as well. And finally, the rows here are going to be inverted relative to the way the state publishes the data. So just bear that in mind. First line, GDP growth, long-run equilibrium, probably not quite 2%. If you look at what you see in, for example, Congressional Budget Office long-term projections, and they do that because of federal budget forecasting and management needs, and they're kind of the go-to source for so their number is also 1.8. We come out of a relatively hot 2024 at 2.5% real GDP growth, then is consistent with the Fed's own inflation goal of 2%. And which, if you go 3 rows down, I've highlighted the rows with those triangles, their objective is set in terms of what's called the core personal consumption expenditure deflator. It's a measure of inflation from which the food and energy components have been stripped, because those tend to be more volatile. So you've got bird flu, egg prices are high. We're going to leave that out, because once all the chickens are dead, then we'll have a new batch of chickens, and then we'll have a bunch of eggs, and the prices will go back down. That kind of volatility we want to remove from the longer term focus that is that guides monetary policy making. Their objective is 2%, and their expectation is that from about 3% inflation last year, it'll take, the next 3 years to get there, or this year and 2 more years to conclude the so-called soft landing, disinflation without a recession. Now, I think the Fed achieved its soft landing objective, but I also think that what Elon and the Muskrats are doing in Trump 2.0 now raises the risk of a recession induced by a fiscal contraction, not contractionary monetary policy, but a fiscal contraction. And the easiest way to think of it is, what was the impact of the federal stimulus payments during the pandemic, or what was the impact of the Obama stimulus in February 2009 in the first month of the Obama administration during the worst recession since the Great Depression? So a fiscal stimulus, it's in the word, stimulus, induces additional economic activity that wouldn't have otherwise occurred, at least in the short run. So it helps with the relaunch in the case of the pandemic, and in the case of Obama-nomics, it helped to gird the underpinnings of the economy, which was suffering from systemic financial erosion, shall we say, if not collapse, and needed to be shored up for a restructuring of the financial system to enable economic recovery to occur, self-driven, so to speak, economic recovery. In terms of a couple more interesting sort of variables, 4% unemployment is the expectation. You can see of the Fed, we're there now. So, and that's important because historically, when you bring inflation down, it tends to have an unemployment cost, right? There tends to be a trade-off, but for a variety of reasons specific to the post-pandemic recovery, in particular, the fact that global supply chains had been disrupted, and the trade-off between unemployment and inflation tends to be associated with movements in aggregate demand. But because global production and distribution was upended by the pandemic, restoring or re-articulating global supply chains meant that you could actually gain disinflation simply by restoring the movement of merchandise across the planet. And so it was possible, and the Fed essentially achieved a disinflation without an increase in unemployment. Very quickly, I might add, it was about a year during which inflation went up. It was about a year during which inflation came down. And then last year was spent mostly trying to figure out how durable the outcome was. But as you can see, what was expected at year end and now has been confirmed was not half bad. So 4% unemployment. And then the other benchmark you want to think about is the overnight interbank lending rate, the rate that banks lend money to one another. So it's a key price for liquidity, for overnight liquidity. Currently stands at about 4.25 to 4.5% target range, and it is expected to subside gradually as the Fed. So the Fed controls this rate. Expected to gradually subside from at least 4.5 to 4% to 3.5 to 3%, or essentially to converge on the so-called neutral rate, so the rate, the short-term interest rate that's consistent with low inflation or stable prices in the congressional mandate for the Federal Reserve, is consistent with low inflation and maximum employment. And maximum employment meaning 97% of people that want to work have a job, and 4% of people who also want to work are between jobs. And there's always some friction. And as you know, your Workforce Development Council people, there's always going to be people moving around for one reason or another. For the U.S. economy, 4% is about the right number. For Hawaii, by the way, it's 3%. And what's the unemployment rate in Hawaii right now? Turns out, as we move along, 3%. So here is DBED's forecast, the state of Hawaii forecast, and it's in the reverse order. So instead of GDP, unemployment rate, and inflation, it's inflation, the unemployment rate, and GDP. That's Hawaii real GDP growth. Okay, so now you're with me. We have higher inflation than the national average right now because of wildfire legacies. So housing costs in Maui's housing market are extraordinarily under extraordinary pressure because of the shortage of housing that has not been mitigated. Like 2,000 houses and haven't been rebuilt. And Bennett's asked me to be polite, so I'm not going to, say anything more about it. Then that's a fact, Jack. And of course, over time, you'd expect inflation to subside to meet the national inflation rate and the Fed's goal. Now, this is a different measure. The Consumer Price Index, which we have for Hawaii, runs about a half percentage point higher than the PCE deflator, which is a national measure. There is a national CPI as well, and what I'm going to say is true for that measure as well. But generally, if the PCE goal is 2%, then the CPI inflation rate will be about 2.5%, maybe 2.4 to 2.5%. And I'll illustrate that in a second. And so DBED, Eugene Chan, my colleague, the chief economist there, and his staff are expecting convergence. The unemployment rate, you can see, they're expecting a continued tight labor market in Hawaii, 3% going to 2.5%, so super tight. And then finally, GDP growth that pretty much matches the national average. And it's important to keep in the back of your mind here, sort of, we're going to grow as fast as the nation. That does not, however, tell us much about where we start, where the starting point for that growth is. And I don't know why I did that. So let's continue with some pictures. Let me illustrate what we just were talking about and what just was released yesterday by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So there you have the 1 year inflation from 2021 to 2022 and the 1 year of disinflation from 2022 to 2023 upon the Federal Reserve's intervention to raise interest rates, roughly coincidental to, but having nothing to do with, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February. The Fed acted in March of 2022, and it took hold very quickly because the Fed intervened more aggressively than it ever has in the past to contain inflation. And one of the important aspects of that is that it did so to affirm the credibility of its commitment to its 2% goal. Now, we mentioned a second ago, 2% inflation measured by the PCE deflator translates into 2.5% inflation measured by the consumer price index. And so here's that pink horizontal line is the equivalent of the 2% goal, 2.5% for consumer price index inflation. The inflation that we grew comfortable with in the 20 teens, which is actually an extraordinary decade in and of itself, the longest economic expansion in history, that inflation was at or below 2%. And indeed, in August 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, the Fed, as it will this year, reported on its, it does a 5-year strategic reassessment of its policies. In the summer of 2020, the Fed clarified that its goal, 2%, was not so much a target as a sort of a, I don't know, like a convergent node. I don't know, you remember your mathematics and a point of agglomeration or something. Like they published this concept they call AIT, average inflation targeting, and then immediately everybody forgot about it. So now everybody's talking about inflation now, and nobody remembers that 2% is sort of the middle of the range. And the reason they did that was because in the 20 teens, inflation was rarely above the target, and the fact that it was consistently, at or below the target means that we should have an expectation that on average it'll be below the target half the time and above the target the other half of the time. And so the debate right now is, as U.S. CPI inflation briefly touched down at 2.5% at the end of last year, and then more recently has been inching back upwards, which is of concern in the financial markets and elsewhere. The question should be, should we be worried about 3% inflation, which is the actual, the number that was released yesterday for the U.S.? If 2.5 is okay, this is so confusing. Nobody cares. Nobody's going to report it correctly in the media. You just have to have, just trust me that it's not that far away from where the Fed wants to be. And on average, it depends on your horizon, right? If you go back 15 years, we're in the zone. So, how much the Fed is going to freak out about this is something they actually themselves are concerned about communicating. And so, in addition to manipulating the overnight rate, they spend a lot of time providing forward guidance. Press conferences, for example, are something that never happened, before 2012, or I think they began under Bernanke. And okay, so in Hawaii, here's the wildfire. You can see that inflation surge, and then the number that was released for January yesterday showed a rebound. I haven't looked into the detail. I don't know what that is, but it's not good. And of course, we start raising tariffs, it's not going to get any better. I'll jump through here. You're welcome to get a copy of this. And but this, if you subtract from bond yields, if you subtract from nominal bond yields, the ones that, the 4.5% yield on the 10-year Treasury note, for example, the corresponding yield on what are called inflation protected securities, so Treasury inflation protected securities, TIPS, are a promise to pay plus a compensation for inflation. So for example, if the bond yield is 4.5% and the TIPS yield is 2%, then 4.5 minus 2% is 2.5%. It's a measure of the bond market's expected inflation for 10 years, for the next 10 years. And you can see there, I've shaded 2.5% is what the market is. Forget what people say. What they reveal, what millions of people trading in the global bond market reveal, is an expectation of 2.5% inflation, which is exactly, what we see the economy trying to achieve right now. Okay, so we jump through these. The Fed's balance sheet is shrinking right now. Technical stuff. Again, I'm going to jump through this. The Fed's going to be re-examining its strategy here, but we'll leave that for another meeting. And then here's the term structure of interest rates, in particular with the overnight rate, the projection we looked at earlier, the Fed's projection of its own target overnight rate subsiding from 4.5% currently to almost 3% at the end of the this 3-year long, or maybe the next 2 years interval of disinflation. Excuse me, I have to cough. Sorry about that. And you might say, well, we're actually, you can see that the problem with long-term interest rates, so all of these interest rates are determined in the market. Only the blue line is set by the Fed. And you can see the volatility I've highlighted here in the heavy black line, which is the yield on the 10-year Treasury note, which has ranged from between 3.5%, to 4.5%. It's at 4.5% now, and it's at 4.5% because as a Trump electoral victory became increasingly probable and then was ratified, at least by the Electoral College, if not strictly speaking, a majority of voters, but a plurality. The concern about future federal budget deficits, given the stated policy preferences of the president and of the new president, and then president-elect and prior there, candidate for president, the concern about larger budget deficits, given the expectation of tax cuts in particular, means that the burden of federal indebtedness will be higher than otherwise might have been the case. And so we're seeing the bond yield move to the upper bound of the recent range. I think it ought to, follow course and end up at a 3.5% number, but we may have to wait 3 years for that. And if I'm right and it gets there, so we have an overnight rate, call it 3, a long-term rate of call it 3.5, then mortgage rates will, because there's idiosyncratic risk with mortgages, right? The borrower may default. Historically, there tends to be a 1.75% premium to the 10-year yield. So if the 10-year yield, this math has changed recently, so it was 4.75. Right now it's 4.5, and if you add the historic premium, then you would get a mortgage rate of, what is that? 4.5 plus 1.75 is that 6.25? Anyway, we're closer to 6.75 because there's an additional 50 basis points of risk premium that has yet to burn off. So, okay, this is the descent of interest rates. The descent, the decrease over time, remains the expectation for the national economy and therefore Hawaii, which has its own problems. So here's a good example where if you look at the months of inventory remaining in Oahu's housing market, they listed homes for sale, homes and condos for sale. Their co-movement from 1995 to 2000, actually April of 2019. This is May right here. I just calculated the other day. It's 0.96. The correlation coefficient is 0.96. These two always move together, or did, until people started to really aggressively think about banning short-term rentals. And so if you're going to ban short-term rentals, and that's what Bill 19 at the Honolulu City Council was designed to do, increase enforcement, credibility, and so on, for undocumented vacation rentals seeking a pathway to citizenship. If you increase the credibility of the enforcement threat of a short-term rental prohibition, then people who are, subverting, people who are buying fireworks or whatever, people who have illegal short-term rentals, so to speak, head for the exits, right? That we got to get out of this theater before it really starts burning. And so condo inventories were already beginning to pile up relative to single family inventories. And then, of course, when tourism dropped, that happened even more. More recently, SB 2919 a year ago, which was passed, governor signed it, everybody's good, let's ban short-term rentals, caused a massive pileup as investors who own short-term rentals, these are mostly in Waikiki, sort of Malka of Kuhio Avenue, the concrete jungle part. So that inventory pileup tells you something about what's happening in the housing market. Inventory's piled up for single family homes too, because at 3%, at a 3% mortgage rate, remember those days? At a 3% mortgage rate, everybody's trying to buy a house and nobody's building them. They're not going to let you build them. And so there's only 1 month of inventory. You see that right here in 2021. And but at a 7% mortgage rate, not a, not as many people are going to be able to qualify for a mortgage. And so you have a tripling of the wait time, so to speak, for a house to close. So, 3 months versus 5 months, that's a material difference when they used to, move together hand in hand and were essentially the same number. Just another tidbit, Maui hasn't rebuilt. I'm not going to dwell on this because it'll get me in trouble. Just to point out, it's been done before. Mayor Joanne Yukimura, after Hurricane Iniki, had no problem rebuilding allowing every house on the island to be rebuilt. And 2/3 of it was authorized 4 months after Iniki. So enough said. And on Oahu, home building is so good, only World War was worse. So, okay, we're not going to talk about that stuff. Let's get into workforce development stuff. So here's what was happening with the population at the end of the 20 teens. And if you run this regression through 2022, like let's say you didn't know last year's and the year before's population numbers, and you're sitting here and starting at about 2016, population stops growing. And then well before the pandemic, people started leaving. It's like nobody knew a pandemic was coming and they're leaving Hawaii. So this is when, we were all starting to talk about, ooh, is Honolulu Detroit? And of course, this happened the last couple of years. Like these numbers right here were published a few weeks ago. I just got them. So, and you know what? Nobody knows this. First of all, if they were listening to me last year, I was still saying this is a fluke. But now it looks like, and so we have some detail. We know that post-pandemic, there was an increase in net international in-migration. Let me say that again. In Hawaii, during the Biden administration, there was international in-migration, which had been decreasing. Right, here's Trump 1.0. And equally surprisingly, there was a decrease in net domestic out migration, which had been increasing in the late 2010s and increasing in Trump 1.0 in particular. So I don't know. Does this have any political? I don't know. I don't know what's happening. I did not expect this. And so, color me schooled, but the population is going back up, which means if you thought, as I think the state of Hawaii did, no offense, I'm not trying to be polite, like, Manette wants me to, but I mean, we were all joking at the time about how, well, this is, if you got a housing shortage, just wait for people to leave and die, then you won't have a housing shortage. But evidently that bet is off. So you need to think about this because you've got a workforce where there are more people aged 65 to 74. These two cohorts right here, there are more people aged 65 to 74 than there are people aged 15 to 24 once I adjust for military personnel. Let me say that again. There are more people retiring every year than there are people in the first-time labor force entrance cohorts. And while that's not true of this weird little boomer Gen X echo of tweens, it's also true that there are more people aged 65 to 74 than there are persons under the age of 10. Okay, so they weren't bored and therefore they can't enter the workforce. And so the tight labor market that you see in a persistent differential between full employment nationwide at 4% and full employment in Hawaii at, let's say 3 going to 2.5, that tightness in the labor market is going to persist. Now, not to get technical here, and I'm going to skip over even more slides because I tell you, Bennett asked me to do this, but it's sort of like a freebie. So this is just a mishmash of slides I already have. I'm not doing any work for you. And, but if you look at the ratio, because job openings leapt to an extraordinary degree in the aftermath of the pandemic, as people said, F you, I'm out of this job. The pandemic taught me I should not have to work for a clown like you when I could die. So I'm going to go get a good job. And right, there's a certain amount of inertia people have in their jobs. The pandemic completely blew that up. People with some skills realized that they could work remotely. People who were exposed to airborne contagion because they were servers at restaurants or bartenders and facing 1,000 different tourists from different places with germs from all over the planet every day they went to work, people reevaluated and the Great Resignation, and so you had this post-pandemic jump, both nationwide and in Hawaii, in the vacancy rate. These are jobs that were open but weren't being filled relative to the unemployment rate. So you can think of the vacancy rate as demand. You can think of the unemployment rate as supply, right? The people who are unemployed or provide a pool of workers that could be hired, and then jobs that remain open are sort of, the demand side where people could be acquiring jobs, and their ratio, if greater than one, means you've got a tight labor market, and if less than one, means you've got a recession essentially. And so that happened. It's over. We need to move on, and the risk right now is that it punches through to the other side of one, which would be a recession. And I'm thinking, yeah, watching Elon, yeah. It's interesting. Now we have these other ways of looking at this. So you can go search Google Trends for global searches on the phrase tight labor market. Isn't this interesting? Like people going on Google and typing in the search phrase tight labor market surged in the late 20 teens. This was not a thing 15 years ago, right? But now everybody's using Google, and now Google's got its AI doing the work for you. It's going to anticipate your search. But anyway, you can see conform with the actual data or the search data. I may have occasion to refer to this. So different kinds of economic indicators we have now, and I'm going to jump over this technical stuff to make two final points here. The first is the so-called unexpected compression in the low wage part of the labor market. So if you look, these are national data. If you look at hourly wages adjusted for inflation of the workers in the lowest decile, their wages went up by the most after the pandemic. And if you look at the hourly wages of persons in the top decile, right, these are the college graduates, their wages post-pandemic went up the least. Why is that? Well, part of it is what I referred to a second ago. A bunch of people, people working in the food service industry, for example, wised up and said, I'm not working in this stupid job. And besides, your restaurant, A, it sucks. And B, I'm going to go work food delivery because that's where my friends are getting their food now, because they're not going to go to a restaurant and go get COVID either. So there were structural changes which were idiosyncratic to the low end market. That's what this stuff is, by the way, if you want to, go back and educate yourself. But at the high end, the opposite thing happened. At the high end of the skill spectrum, people chose to be compensated in amenities rather than hourly wages. People's preferences shifted towards remote work, diminished commutes, more time with their families and their children, etc. And so you see, so again, get a copy of the slides. This is really important for you in the Workforce Development Council, that you understand that these opposite things happen across the distribution of skills and compensation in the workforce. And when you pair that with the fact that that labor supply is constrained by the underlying demographics, future workers weren't born. Excuse me, future workers weren't born, and there are more old people than young people to begin with, and the old people are going to retire. So my guess, the big task for workforce development is how to keep old people, you know, at least productive, if not working per se. And one of the ways to do that is to have Elon Musk blow up Social Security, which is, may happen. So I guess getting the drift here, I'm going to speed up and jump to like a Q&A end here in a second. Among the spillovers, remote work caused a surge in home prices. And let me just spend a few minutes talking about remote work because I know, RTO, Trump 2.0 has embraced return to office, which is stupid, by the way. And because working from home is here to stay. So again, let's look at Google Trends. This is really interesting. You can look at what's important by just looking at Google. So here I've indexed, and by the way, I stole this from Hal Therian, who is Google's chief economist. Hal was the first one I saw who did this, and I was like, Eureka. So let's benchmark. We'll set 100 on the scale here, and which is in logs. We'll set 100 equal to the highest search volume Google ever got on the phrase working from home, which, as you can imagine, was right after the pandemic. How the hell am I going to work from home? This is March or April, maybe 2020. And relative to that volume of searches, relative to that search volume, what was the volume pre-pandemic? So 1/10. And what was the pandemic, post-pandemic, kind of stabilization point, double the pre-pandemic benchmark. So 20%, not 10% of the pandemic search volume. And indeed, we don't have data for Hawaii because nobody thought to even ask how many people were working remotely pre-pandemic. It was not a thing. But in the US data, you can see that pre-pandemic, about 90% of people never or almost never work from home. We now have Hawaii data post-pandemic, and about 25% of people now work remotely, either full-time or hybrid. And it's a very stable pattern, about half full-time, half hybrid. It's so stable that we now have 3 years of data which start to look like, hey, look, there's seasonality. Seasonality, right? Look, school's out, boink, school's out, boink. So all the high school kids go get a job, but the job high school kids, they got to go work in the workplace. They cannot work remotely because they're not educated enough, so they don't have blah blah blah. Very stable pattern. And if some whack job in your HR department says you got to go back to work, the question should be, why, yo? The most highly educated and therefore most highly skilled workers, and therefore the persons with the highest incomes, clearly have revealed their preference for, as I suggested earlier, amenities as opposed to pay per se, at least at this moment of transition, among which components of the amenity package is working from home. There's much more data on this. We don't have time. But the point I was trying to make is that the blast wave, as it radiates outward through the economy, is changing the structure of the economy. People who don't drive to work, don't catch the bus to work, don't stop at the mall on the way home. They don't stop at the gym on the way home. They're already home. And so you can see the shock waves not just in office utilization, but in retail and recreational commercial space. In the residential real estate market, you see this on Oahu in this extraordinary expression of what's called the donut effect. The balance of housing demand spatially shifted outward from the urban core and away from multifamily housing, away from condos, towards the suburbs and exurbs where detached dwellings are mostly located. And you can see that expression in this jump in home prices, bit of an overshoot. Of course, interest rates went up right here dramatically. How dramatically? Half the population of Hawaii has never lived in a time when interest rates went up by as much as they did in 2022 and 23. Let me say this again. No person under the age of 40 had ever lived in a time when interest rates went up by as much as they did. And it's amazing that we didn't have a recession, but we didn't because people got that wrong. That was totally wrong, by the way. We were never going to have a recession. This was always about a soft landing. What's interesting about the soft landing is that single family home prices are back on the pre-pandemic equilibrium trajectory, right? What's equilibrium in the housing market? The rate of appreciation of home prices. The rate at which they rise is the equilibrium. It's dynamic equilibrium. You know, all these people say, oh, we have to make affordable houses with lower prices. No, bro, they're never going to be lower. Okay? You can make more of them, but they're never going to be lower unless you make more of the lower priced houses, which is the actual solution. Go build more houses. But you're not going to make the prices of these houses lower. The equilibrium is the 4% appreciation that I show here. Let's call it 4.5. What's 4.5% annual appreciation minus 2.5% inflation? 4.5 minus 2, 2% real long-term appreciation of home prices is the equilibrium for Hawaii. And there's remote work, and the donut effect on the neighbor islands is even larger. The donut effect from remote work because the neighbor islands are Zoom towns. The neighbor islands are where vagabond workers can go get a short-term rental, and oops, we're going to ban short-term rentals. That's a good idea. Final reason to think about structural change, and again, in this broad context, you have a huge structural shift in the workforce, a huge impediment to workforce growth from demographics, a huge structural shift in the revealed preference for remote work among the highest skilled, highest paid workers, and then a long-term shift in the composition of households towards independent living, which means even if the population had not changed, you should have built more houses because she doesn't have to live with that punk ass husband she divorced anymore. She can get her own condo and become senior vice president. So beat it, loser. And right, so these, old people don't have to live with their kids. And however much we romanticize the intergenerational household. Okay, so I'm going to stop here.
Okay.
This is the part that's important for you, and we can talk about Q&A. There's more to this, but we're going to stop here, and I'll leave this up for a second while you want to throw a question at me.
I have one.
Anybody?
Paul.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So it was interesting you mentioned about the recession and that you alluded to the fact that we might be
Headed into
almost
recession.
there nationally, at least nationally, right?
We could be there right now, by the way. I mean, this
Yeah.
quarter. Yeah.
So is there anything that Hawaii can do to insulate herself or mitigate that recession impact?
No.
No. Okay. So we are going to be affected no matter what.
Well, so look. Hold on a second. I mean,
Obviously, we have no span of control over the natural what happens on the
well,
national
let me
level.
take that back a second. We could do this.
Mm,
It's been done before. I mean, in 1973, this is Oahu. But this is the world I grew up in, so I know it's been done. This is a world before computers. This is Pong right here. A computer was Pong right here. So, we could, right? We could build 6 times as many housing units on average every year, like we did for a quarter century before, I don't know, the Sierra Club or who are these guys? Land Use Commission, inclusionary zoning, all that stuff. So, but if my answer to your question is there something that Hawaii autonomously can do? Yeah, triple home building. I mean, right on Maui. By the way, I have Maui data back to the 1960s. I have it for all the counties. In the early 1970s, when this was going on Oahu, Maui was building 3,000 housing units per year, and now they're building 500. So strictly speaking, the answer to your question is, yeah, sure, we can do something, but is it going to happen? No. So I would say get ready for now. The part of the federal government that's crucial to Hawaii's economic performance is the military sector. And I doubt that there are going to be layoffs in that area. I mean, unless you're the DEI person at, Fort Shafter, your job's probably in good shape. But there were more layoffs announced today, right? Weren't all you saw all the new hires just lost their job. There's all of the future, right? All of the future human capital of the federal workforce was just fired like today with an email. So the short-term impact is layoffs, but the medium-term impact is two things. You're not going to have the skills development within that cohort of new workers as the seasoned workers, eventually age out or whatever, but now are going to head for the hills because the federal government, Trump 2.0, has signaled adversely to prospects for, um, you know, uh, uh, security of federal employment, and that means that recruiting is going to be harder, and so on and so forth. But in just material, if you're talking about mass layoffs, I mean, if we were talking about the auto industry doing mass layoffs, we would be concerned about, incipient recession, wouldn't we? So is the federal government that big? The question is it big enough, to say, no, I am going to show this? Is it big enough, to knock a percentage point or two off the growth of GDP? Yeah, possibly. And since we now arrived here, here's the bad news. Hawaii will match the US growth rate. In fact, Hawaii has always matched the US growth rate, sometimes above, sometimes below. But the expectation is Hawaii is never going to make up for this loss. And by the way, I'm not showing the other 50 states, all of which have outperformed Hawaii. So, or was that? So Bennett and I were talking about how much dancing I should do about this fact. But so, you know, between you and me, Hawaii's in last place. But the problem is that, as Bennett says, if there's something we can do, surely we would have done it already to get back to where we were on to the path. Again, the equilibrium is the path. In the case of tourism, it's what would it take to get back on this path? But the state's policy is we don't want to get on the path. The path is to have fewer visitors. So I think it is going to take, a pretty substantial reorientation of this is about ban short-term rentals, get rid of the tourists. We don't want those Holly investors. I mean, that's going on right now. And it has MAGA elements of its own. And, MAGA is as close to a majority as it's ever been. The approval ratings for what's happening in DC are actually, higher than 50%. I mean, at first blush, people are okay with, yeah, fire those guys. So, the question is how big of a train wreck will have to unfold before. And my concern is that the ledge, they're not talking about this. They're not talking about how many housing units on average were authorized by building permit annually in Hawaii, statewide, for the last 15 years. 15 years. Answer, 2,500 units per year. Now, last year, there was a little bump, but it's 2,500. 18,000. So your question, I think, has, it's reasonable to ask, couldn't we just crank up the stuff we're in control of? Because here's another thing we're not in control of. We've actively worked to suppress tourism, right? Aquaman tweeted, do not go to Maui after the wildfire. It's like, bro, you could go to Wailea. I mean, I'm just saying, don't go to Lahaina, go to Wailea. If there's a wildfire in Nanakuli, people don't go to Waikiki, you know what I mean? But that's where people get their information, is social media, right? The influencers, the messaging of the influencers is more important than the messaging of the HTA. And what's the messaging of the Hawaii Tourism Authority? Malama Aina, who volunteer for work taro loi on Saturday. While you're on vacation, we'll volunteer for work taro loi. What? So that's we can't manage 150 yen per dollar, 160 yen per dollar. Oh hell no, we should all go to Tokyo Disney. Those guys come over here, they're poor. Wealthy Japanese people come over here, and 160 yen per dollar. So we have to control the things we can. But let's bring it back to workforce development. It's really important to take the 5 kids that were actually born and have one of them know how to code and another one, know how to like use AI to do the grunt work so that they can be liberated to make a more productive contribution in the tasks that they're assigned. Are we training kids to do that, or are we training kids to grow up in Hawaii believing that they will never have a future, and as soon as they can get out of here, they should go to the Ninth Island and work in casinos? That's a leadership issue, and
Okay,
can we
so
do
Paul,
science in Hawaii? Yeah, okay, I'll stop. Yeah, questions? Yeah,
only because of the time element, and you
I
and I
appreciate that. Yeah, sorry.
have talked,
Sure.
long discussions and hours, and I so
Yeah.
appreciate you.
Gong, cut.
Yeah.
What?
No,
Next
no,
question.
but let me just have one more question because the hour
Okay.
is upon us. Is there
Okay. Yeah.
anybody online who would like to ask a question of Paul?
Oh, and you can email me at paulbrewbaker@tceconomics.com.
Yes. And by the way,
There.
the reason why, okay, the reason why my name is all over, just so you know, because there's so many Benet Misalucha, is because I inadvertently sent out a link because the registration is supposed to be unique. Okay, when you register, it will give
Yeah,
you a
yeah, yeah.
unique link. But in our desire to, to remind people, we inadvertently sent out the same link as mine. So that's why they're all showing. So if you can identify yourself, whoever it is who's raised their hand, please go
I
ahead.
don't see a hand raised. Is there anything in the chat that I should be looking at?
There's somebody who raised their hand.
Hello,
Please, yes.
my name is Neva Supe-Roque. I work at Windward Community College with
Oh yeah, yeah, I taught there.
with the Workforce Development Office.
Very good.
Yeah, we're really pushing in with the AI section, and
Yeah.
I want to say I thank you for this presentation. We've had conversations based upon, the middle management and, who is getting ready to retire and who's still going to be working. So I myself did teach a workforce development training in AI. And I'm
Cool.
in that older demographic. But but my question is, okay, so you're talking about construction, right? There's other
Yes.
things that we got to take into consideration, which is the tariffs, right, that are coming in,
Yes.
all
Yeah.
of that, and it's going to be a lot more expensive to build the homes. I'm not sure, I don't know if anybody else can speak to this, but here on Oahu, it's there's not as much space as like the Big Island. That's where I'm from, where the
Right.
cost homes are a little bit cheaper. You can at least buy something under $1 million, right? What
For
strategy?
sure.
Yeah, so what
Okay.
strategies
Yes.
we implicate as a workforce development for that?
Easy answer. So the bumper sticker, keep the country country, and I'm a Kailua boy, so okay. Keep the country country. Okay, my bumper sticker, make the city city.
Mm.
Okay. Why is urban rail important? It's not about transportation. It's about housing. It's where you build in the 21st century. You build within the urban footprint, and it's all about density. So, sure, go be a carpenter or maybe be an iron worker. You know what I mean? I'm just saying there's a different kind of building that occurs at density than stick framing a house out in Waialua. Now, Big Island is a fascinating place in that you might think, oh, counterexample, because Big Island, all the other islands fit inside Big Island with land left over. Or here's another one. You hear people on Maui say, oh, we reached our carrying capacity. No, bruh, Maui's bigger than Oahu and has 1/8 the population, 1/6 the population. Well, I think it's 1/6. I mean, and make the city. Help the poor people out by building apartment complexes in Kahului and having a good bus system. You know what I mean? Build in and around Kona town and stop faking it and make like, oh no, it's Kona town. But I come from Kailua. Dude, I could tell you the Kailua neighborhood board, those guys, get them out of here, right? The Kailua neighborhood board literally shooting down affordable housing over by, the kind, I still call it Andy's Drive-In, but it's like a auto parts store, right? Why is there no, if you go Poly Bottle Shop in the middle of Kailua, what's on the second floor? Apartments. Poly Bottle Shop, ground floor. The old CPB branch used to be over, but then they moved now. Residential on the upper floor. That's every town in America. That's illegal in Honolulu. Mixed use development, illegal. If you go up behind Longs and Kailua, oh, we get parking structure. Wow. Kailua town get parking structure. Why aren't there 6 stories of apartments on top of that? I'm just saying, we need to build. The only way we can build once and it's really not about, it's about this, it's space-time, not space. Once you reach an hour commute, it's not worth commuting. There's no job on Oahu that's worth commuting for more than an hour to get to. And so we're at that point where you got to bring the people into the urban core. Now, here's the problem. The urban core land is more expensive. So you got to be really creative on how you do it. But we could go on and on, but you get my point. The 2 themes for me would be, where does the number 1, number 2, number 3 bus line go? And why is it the number 1, 2, and 3 bus line? Make the city. And then, hey, we can argue about the train. What a lame ass train. You want to see a good urban rail system that was started when I was in college? Go to Vienna, because sophomore year, I was in Vienna and they started building the U-Bahn. And now Vienna rocks. Okay, train goes from nowhere to nowhere. Put condos at every train station, etc., etc. That's my answer.
Paul, I wish we had so much time because again, you're a fountain of knowledge. But so we're grateful to you for sharing your
No problem. Yeah.
Juliana. And I truly appreciate it. And I know you're doing this as a personal favor to me. So mahalo, mahalo, mahalo. Thank you. And thank
Right
you
there,
for joining
email.
us from Oregon. But here's his contact information,
Actually,
folks.
Colorado, sorry.
Sorry, you're not in Oregon, you're Colorado. I keep saying Oregon, but you're in Colorado, where
Holy
it's
land.
10 degrees.
Yeah, it was -4 the other night. I got all
Oh my
bundled up and
goodness.
went out and
Okay, well, anyway, again, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much. And we'll certainly take the insights that you shared and hopefully try to incorporate it into the plan and the implementation. So we're aligning ourselves with the economic landscape. Again, mahalo everyone for joining us. Thank you again. And we will have a copy of this posted on our website later on.
I'll send a PDF right after this.
Thank you. Mahalo.
Thank you.
So much, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vanette.